Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. We're going to be discussing the special education enrollment gaps in Louisiana, charter versus traditional schools. My name is Shannon Lasserre-Cortez. I'll be your facilitator today. I'm a senior research lead at REL Southwest for the Louisiana Teacher Prep and Professional Development Partnership. We have a full agenda today. First, we will conduct a welcome, event orientation, and speaker introductions, a review of the research, researcher reflectings on the findings, practitioner reflection on the findings, facilitated presenter discussion and Q&A, and a thank you and stakeholder feedback survey. Our presenters today include Patrick Wolf, Distinguished Professor of Education Policy, University of Arkansas, Tessie Bailey, Principal Technical Assistance Consultant, American Institutes for Research, and Sametta Brown, Retired Chief Education Officer at New Beginning Schools Foundation. So how does REL Southwest do this work? REL Southwest conducts its work in partnership with education stakeholders in 5 states in our region: Arkansas, Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. To address the identified priorities and interests of our 5 states, REL Southwest supports 6 different collaborative research partnerships. REL Southwest conducts its work primarily through collaborative research partnerships with school districts, state education agencies, policymakers, and others in our region. These partnerships focus on high-leverage education issues that our partners or others in the field have identified as priorities. Through these partnerships, we conduct research to advance understanding of education issues, support regional stakeholders in building capacity to use data and evidence in education practice, and to translate research into actionable results and tools. This report was completed under a previous research partnership, the Louisiana Charter School Research Alliance. The goal of today's Bridge event is to provide attendees with information about the special education enrollment gap between charter schools and traditional schools in Louisiana. The Bridge event outcomes will be to gain a better understanding of the population of students in special education and their enrollment rates in charter schools and traditional schools in Louisiana, to understand the factors associated with differences in classification and enrollment rates of students with individualized education programs, or IEPs, and to learn about the report findings, applications, and implications for practice. At the end of this webinar, we will conduct a stakeholder feedback survey. Don't forget to tell us what you thought about the webinar by completing our stakeholder feedback survey. Your responses will help us to improve future events. Our webinar today includes closed captioning. Follow these directions to set up closed captioning. If you have any technical issues with this, please type it in the chat box and someone will assist you. The study we will be discussing today is the Special Education Enrollment and Classification in Charter Schools and Louisiana Traditional Schools. Our presenter, Dr. Patrick Wolf, is Distinguished Professor of Education Policy and 21st Century Endowed Chair in School Choice in the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas. He previously taught at Columbia and Georgetown Universities. As principal investigator of the School Choice Demonstration Project, he has led or is leading major studies of school choice initiatives, including longitudinal evaluations of school voucher programs in Washington, D.C., Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the state of Louisiana. Research projects led by or co-led by Dr. Wolf have been awarded 34 research grants and contracts totaling nearly $22 million. He has authored, co-authored, or co-edited 4 books and nearly 150 journal articles, book chapters, and policy reports on school choice, civic values, special education, public management, and campaign finance.
Thank you, Shannon. I'm delighted to be here and participating in this webinar. I will be presenting research that I completed in partnership with Shannon Lasserre-Cortez as part of the previous REL Southwest contract with the U.S. Department of Education. I'm going to discuss the background and objectives of that research, the study regions that were covered, the research questions, our data and samples, the methods that we use to analyze those data, and our findings and implications. As background, for a long time, policymakers and the broader public and educators have been concerned about an enrollment gap between traditional schools and charter schools regarding students with special needs. A national study of data from 2009-10 indicated that on average, public charter schools enroll 3 percentage points fewer students with special needs than do traditional schools. In Louisiana, a year later, data indicated that the charter school special ed enrollment gap in that state was about 2 percentage points, so slightly lower than the national average. Our study objectives are to explore the special education enrollment rate gaps between the charter and traditional school sectors, to identify factors associated with differences in classification and declassification rates of students with individualized education programs across these sectors, in part to determine if different classification and declassification rates explain any gaps that we identify. And finally, to focus on the 4 educational regions of Louisiana with 3 or more charter schools in 2010-11. These are the areas of the state that have a substantial charter school presence. Here is a map of the state of Louisiana, and it contains 8 education regions. The 4 regions that are highlighted are the 4 that are covered in our study. You see that they vary greatly in terms of their geographic size. The largest one, highlighted in green, is the Ouachita region that includes a number of rural parishes and really no large cities. The purple area is the Jefferson Parish region, and that includes a variety of suburban type parishes and some rural parishes as well that sort of flow from the suburbs of New Orleans west. The red region is Baton Rouge, containing the city of Baton Rouge and the suburban areas around it. And the blue area is the New Orleans region, which includes Orleans Parish and St. Tammany Parish. So that's a completely urban area. So one attractive feature of our study is it includes this variation in terms of regions that are all or mostly rural and regions that are all or mostly urban. Our first research question is, how has the enrollment rate of students with an IEP differed between open enrollment charter schools and traditional schools between the 2010-11 and 2013-14 school years, overall and by specific educational region? We use a student having an individualized education plan as the indicator that they are a student with special needs. So that is our indicator measure of students with disabilities, students with special needs in our study. As sub-questions we ask, does the size of the gap vary across schools that serve elementary, middle, and high school levels? And does the size of the gap vary across different disability classifications? Our second major research question is, were special education classification and declassification rates different between charter and traditional schools between the baseline year and the end year of our study? And do any differences hold up when we control for student grade and for continuous years enrolled in the same school? Because we know that those 2 factors are likely to influence the likelihood of a given student being newly classified as having a disability or being declassified. The data we used for this study came from the Louisiana Department of Education, and it includes information for all public school students and schools in those 4 regions that we highlighted from 2010-11 through 2013-14. We have variables at the school level that include a public charter school or traditional public school indicator, and also the educational region that the school is located in. And we have student level variables that include student grade, whether the student had an IEP, and the specific category or categories of disability that was part of their classification. Our sample for research question 1 involved tracking all K-12 public school students in the study regions. That included more than 366,000 students in our baseline year of 2010-11 and nearly 400,000 students in our final year of 2013-14. Now, throughout this period, the proportion of students in our sample who were attending charter schools varied from 5.7% to 10.9%. For research question 2, we took the 2010-11 cohort of students and we tracked them consistently across our outcome years, our 3 outcome years of 2011-12, 2012-13, and 2013-14. Because for that second question, we wanted to see if there was a change in disability classifications for the exact same set of students. Whereas for the first question, we wanted to just take a snapshot of students in the traditional sectors and the charter sector across 4 time periods. So our methods are slightly different to answer the 2 questions. For research question 1, we examined variation in the special education enrollment gap by year, by region, by grade level, and by disability type. We used descriptive statistics with conventional statistical significance tests in order to identify any differences that are meaningful in terms of being more than just what we might expect by chance. For research question 2, we examined possible differences in special education classification and declassification rates using statistical regression models that control for other important factors. First, here is a diagram of the change in the charter special education enrollment gap across the 4 years of our study. And you see that it declined rather dramatically from 2.5% in 2010-11 to just 0.5% in 2013-14, meaning by the end of our study, traditional schools enrolled just half of a percentage point more students with special needs than did the charter schools in our study. We see that this special ed enrollment gap varied significantly by the grade level of students. The younger students in grade K-5 were disproportionately in traditional schools if they had a disability. That is, the enrollment level of students with disabilities in traditional schools was 2.3 percentage points higher for students in K-5 than they were in students in traditional or in charter schools. Whereas in the middle school grades of 6 through 8, charters and traditional schools enrolled students with disabilities at exactly the same rate. There was no enrollment gap for students with disabilities in the middle school grades. And finally, in the high school grades, averaged across all of these 4 regions in Louisiana, we found that the special education enrollment gap actually flipped to favoring charter school enrollments. So students with disabilities were enrolled in charter schools at a higher percentage, about 1.7 percentage points higher, if they were in the high school grades compared to the traditional schools. Other important findings included that the gap was lowest in the Baton Rouge region in all 4 years. You'll recall that that's an urban region in our study that's had a large number of public charter schools for a sustained period of time. The gap was highest in the Ouachita region for 3 of the 4 years, and Ouachita is the most rural region and had fewest charter schools that had been operating for a sustained period of time. The gap favored charters for students with the specific classification of emotional disturbance. So students with emotional disturbance were enrolled in public charter schools at a higher rate than they were enrolled in traditional schools. The traditional schools had higher enrollments of students in most other disability categories compared to the charter schools, particularly the categories of disability that were low incidence and severe in their effects on children. We also found that charter school enrollment was not associated with a difference in the likelihood of being newly classified as requiring an IEP. So a student in a charter school was just as likely to be newly classified as requiring an IEP as was a student in a traditional school. But we did find that being enrolled in a charter school was associated with an increased likelihood of being declassified as no longer requiring an IEP. We think there are important implications from the findings from this research. The Louisiana charters have reduced the special education enrollment gap across charters and traditional schools. The study occurred even before new policies in 2014-15 were enacted to better fund and support students with IEPs in charters. So we suspect that follow-on research that looks at these kinds of data may find that the enrollment gap, the charter school special education enrollment gap in Louisiana may be completely eliminated by now. Some sector specialization is apparent. Charters seem to be particularly attractive to students with emotional disturbance and students in the high school grades. And traditional schools tend to be most attractive to students with lower incidence disabilities and those in the earlier grades. We saw that the gaps were consistently lower in urban compared to rural regions. We also saw that the charter schools had a higher rate of declassification. And this is something that's been replicated in other empirical studies in other parts of the country. Now, we don't take a position on whether a declassification or classification in general is a good thing. Obviously, we want students who need special education services to be appropriately classified and students who don't need special education services not to be classified. But of course, we don't know exactly what the alignment is between the classification and the underlying need of the child. So we just observe the patterns of classification and declassification and don't really take a position on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing if those rates differ across the two sectors. So our findings here are informed by a number of studies, and they are contained in this extensive research report that is linked here and is available at the Southwest REL webpage. It also includes a more extensive set of references that explore this question of the enrollment and serving of students with special needs in charter schools. If you have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box for questions for presenters, and I'll be happy to respond to them during the general question and answer period. And I thank you for your attention. I enjoyed sharing this exciting work with you.